Welcome back to the series exploring Herman Dooyeweerd's roots of Western culture. In the fourth episode, we will look at Dooyeweerd's account of the Christian ground motive of creation, fall and redemption found in the last part of chapter 1. As before, I'll give an overview of some of the key themes and then focus in on one or two issues. Dooyeweerd begins his account of the Christian ground motive with the motive of creation. And he says that creation is both radical and integral. By radical, he means gets to the root or the heart of things. And by integral, he means encompasses everything. So in terms of radical, it's helpful to think of roots literally in terms of perhaps the roots of a tree that nourishes the tree, that gives it life and helps the whole thing to grow. Now, in terms of integral, later on, Dooyeweerd likes to quote the Psalm 139. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? This idea that there's no area of creation where we're not in God's presence. Another element of this idea of radical is that the heart of creation is found in the human heart itself. And the human heart isn't to be thought of merely as an individual thing, but is part of the community of humankind. First in Adam, and we have the solidarity of the whole of humankind in the fall. And then secondly in Jesus Christ, where there's the opportunity for the whole of humanity to be centered in a new root, a new community that brings about redemption. Dooyeweerd goes on to explain the idea of humans as made in God's image in terms of our lordship over creation, our responsibility to develop creation and the potentials built into creation. But this lordship or rulership is done in the light of service. Another element of the integral character of creation is this idea that we shouldn't view reality or elements of reality as cut off or separate. And Dooyeweerd uses the example of materialism, which thinks of the world or thinks of nature in terms of kind of physical laws and thereby cutting nature off from humankind, whereas in fact we are integral and part of creation. Dooyeweerd emphasizes that ground motives are powerful. They have an influence on us. They shape the way we live our lives. Think about what Jesus said when he said, "Those that listen to my words and act on them are like someone who builds their house on a rock." And this is what Dooyeweerd is encouraging us to do, to build our house on the rock, not to build just part of our life on the Christian message and the Christian ground motive, but the whole of our lives. And that if we're not careful, we'll find that other ground motives are influencing us. And that's like having our house half built on sand and half built on rock. To illustrate this need to build our life on the ground motive of creation, fall and redemption, Dooyeweerd uses the example of the influence of the Greek ground motive on the way we often think about the soul. Unfortunately, we often think about the soul as something separate from the body, and we think of it in terms of particular functions or aspects of human nature. The Greek philosophers especially like to think of the soul as something rational and immortal, with the body being something material and to do with the senses and desires. And we've often carried over that kind of idea of a soul and a body as accounting for two different angles or aspects of human life. And Dooyeweerd wants to give us a more scriptural account of the soul in line with the Christian ground motive, whereas the soul or the heart is the center of human life and not one aspect of it. He likes to quote from Proverbs, "Keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flow the springs of life." So that all the issues of life, all of the areas of life spring out of the heart. This links in again with this idea of where from your spirit can I hide. By beginning with the heart as the center of human existence, the biblical ground motive avoids creating a tension or conflict between different areas of human life, where one part of what it means to be human gets devalued and another part gets deified. So for the Greeks, the idea of reason and rationality was considered the true nature of humankind, and that linked in with their notion, particularly in Aristotle, of God as something purely rational. The other thing that Dooyeweerd develops is the idea of sin as also being radical in that it affects the heart and so will affect the whole of life. But he also wants to point out that sin is relative and dependent on God, that sin exists only in a false relation to God and is never independent. It is allowed by virtue of creation. This is another area of important difference with the Greek ground motive, which sees two origins of reality in the form motive and the matter motive. Dooyeweerd finishes this section with a discussion of common grace in relation to antithesis, and here he explains the relation, if you like, between the creation motive and the motive of the fall. I want to focus now on the cultural mandate within the context of the creation motive. And I've given this quote here. You can find it on page 30. It's the same paragraph where Dooyeweerd talks about God creating us as Lord of creation. And I really love this quote because it gives such a rich understanding of our world. And it's very different from how we often think. We often think in terms of nature in those kind of materialist sense, that creation or nature is the physical world that just goes along. It's atoms and energy and maybe living things growing and so on. And then we think of human activity as something kind of different and on top of that. But in this quote, Dooyeweerd talks about the powers and potentials which God has enclosed within creation. And it's our task as made in God's image to disclose or uncover and develop these powers and potential. And what he's referring to here is our ability to make families and create art and communities and develop political institutions and centres of learning and businesses and things like this. So we've got, and all of that is enclosed within creation. It's part of the meaning of the world in which we live in. And we're called to develop and disclose these things and to do so under the command to serve God and our neighbour, under the command of love. The last section of this chapter on common grace completes Dooyeweerd's account of the Christian ground motive of creation, fall and redemption. And it focuses more on fall and redemption. It also brings us back to the idea of antithesis. So there's quite a few ideas in here, which is why I thought it was worth going into a bit more detail. Dooyeweerd begins with the idea of sin, saying that it's radical. And so we should remember that radical means affecting the root, which of course means the human heart. And so out of the heart flow the issues of life, as Proverbs says. And Jesus in the Gospels says that from out of the heart flow evil thoughts, evil desires and evil actions. But Dooyeweerd points out that it's not just the whole of human life that is affected by sin, but in fact the whole of creation. We can see this in Romans 8, where St. Paul talks about creation being subjected to frustration. So if the whole of creation is affected in sin, then when we come to redemption, redemption has to be equally radical, affecting the whole of human life and affecting the whole of creation. And this then brings us to ideas of common grace and antithesis. Dooyeweerd understands common grace in terms of God upholding the fallen world, upholding it by his creation word, by the ordinances of creation. That means upholding the kind of order of creation. We can think also in terms of the cultural mandate, so those powers and potentials that we are to bring out in service of God and love of neighbour. So what are these ordinances? And we can think in terms of government. It should be in terms of justice. There should be peace and cooperation in society, care in the way we raise and educate young and those who are vulnerable, honesty in our speech, stewardship and generosity in the possessions that we have and the resources that we have, and so on. Now the point is that each of these are part of the potentials and structures and order of creation, and all of these can be recognized in various ways by people who've rejected God. So there we have the common grace element. However, Dooyeweerd also wants to say that when we reject God, we replace God with an idol, and that brings disharmony within the way we think about all of these human tasks. And in order to get the true harmony and in serving God, we have to follow the love commands to love God with all of our lives and to love our neighbours as ourselves. So this then can help us understand the idea of common grace and antithesis, that those that reject God can recognize and pursue many of the good elements that are there in creation that as humans we are to develop and use. But it's only in the renewal and redemption that comes in Christ that we can begin to bring all of these tasks together in service of God and in service of our neighbour, so that the love command gives the unity and harmony that we need. And that's why, as Christians, the idea of the antithesis and building our life on the ground motive of creation, fall and redemption, seeing all of these as radical and integral, is fundamental to building our life on the rock.